where truth and fiction collide. You're listening to John Christie. This is the intersection of Christianity and culture.
You are listening to John Christie, and I am John Christie. So you're going to have to listen to me at least for a little while here. That's what the announcer said anyway. Well, today I will be talking with a guest. His name is John Wise, and John hosts a podcast named The Christian Atheist, along with his wife Jenny. But today I'll only be talking with John, and I'll be doing that in a few moments. But first, before I get there, I want to address an email that I received this week. And I take the email very seriously, and I could hear concern in the writer's voice as I read the email. So let me go ahead, read the email to you first and talk about it before I bring on my guest, and then we'll get into John and what makes him the Christian atheist. But first, this was the email that was in my inbox this week. It starts, "Hi John, I really enjoyed your show last week on morality with Scott. I felt like you both had interesting points and made me think a lot this past week. I have to tell you, I was very bothered by your answer and acceptance that God commanded the killing of innocent babies as his judgment. I understand God is the judge of all mankind, but the biggest question that I felt was not answered was, how do we know when it's God's judgment or just men believing God judged? The terrorists who bombed buildings and caused 9/11 all believed it was God's judgment. People still do innocent killings believing they heard from God and it's God's judgment. Scott mentioned David Koresh, and you never responded about why he was wrong and not hearing from God. Or do you believe he was right and did hear from God? I assume you don't agree with David Koresh or the terrorist killings in the name of God, but on what basis? This is very worrying to me, and I'd like to ask you directly if you heard God command you to kill a group of heathen children so they could go straight to heaven, and straight to heaven is in quotes, like you said, would you do it? I hope to hear an answer from you, Kelly." I'm not going to give last name or anything, but Kelly's good enough. So like I said, this struck me for two reasons. Number one, because I didn't really address that with Scott last week. I think towards the end, we kind of got to that point with David Koresh, and Scott had mentioned he was concerned as well, or it was troubling to him that people are claiming to hear from God and bring about judgment. And I know that was the end of the show, and I was saying, there's so much more we can talk about, and we'll agree to disagree at this point, and we'll move on. And we kind of ended the show. We were over the normal 2 hours, and it was basically my poor attempt to wrap it up, I guess. But I guess it also didn't resonate with me exactly that was the same idea that Scott was portraying, that basically, killing in the name of God today, people are doing this, and that I would agree with that in a sense. And so let me answer these questions first, and then I'll get into my explanation. So Kelly mentioned Scott stated David Koresh, and you never responded about why he was wrong and not hearing from God. Or do you believe he was right and did hear from God? I'm not sure particularly what really this would have to do with the God commanding killing of other people, innocent people. David Koresh, as far as I know, never brought something like that out. He did say he heard from God. And I do believe people today do hear from God in different ways. So I can't judge whether or not David Koresh ever heard from God or not. But I will say, and what I will get to in explaining, is that anyone that today would claim that God, at least the God of the Bible, the God of Judeo-Christianity, Jesus Christ, if they ever believe that God is telling them to kill anyone, that they're not hearing from that God. And I'll explain why that is in just a moment. But no, I don't believe God is telling and commanding people today to do that, whether it's the terrorists of 9/11 or it's a mother with her children, which we've had those situations, or it's a serial killer who's being told to do that. I don't believe any of them are hearing from God. I assume you don't agree. This is Kelly again. I assume you don't agree with David Koresh or the terrorist killings in the name of God, but on what basis? Well, again, I picked a couple verses to exegete, to elaborate on, to answer that. So give me a moment and I will. This is very worrying to me, and I'd like to ask you directly, if you heard God command you to kill a group of heathen children so they could go straight to heaven, again in quotes, like you said, would you do it? The like you said referring to my point, which I know is an uncomfortable point, but based on the reasons I gave last week of believing that innocent children do go to heaven or the presence of the Lord, I'd say, regardless of whether it was a natural cause or it was caused by Israelites or whomever, or a terrorist nowadays or anyone. So yes, I do believe that they still would be immediately in the presence of the Lord, but would I do it if I heard God command me to kill a group, what do they say? To kill a group of heathen children so they could go straight to heaven? And my answer absolutely would be no, I would not do it, because again, that would not be God. And why do I say that? Why do I say that the Israelites, while God commanded the Israelites to kill the Canaanite children, or that, as I mentioned last week, possible justification of God killing the firstborn of the Egyptian children, or any killings that God had done or commanded to be done in his name or for his judgment, why would I defend those of the Bible but not agree that that happens today, or anyone that hears that happens today? And let me explain it this way. In the Old Testament and the New Testament are not two different books. The New Testament is an extension of the Old Testament. It's a fulfillment, and it explains that to us. It's a fulfilling of God's law. It's a fulfilling of the covenant that God had established with Israel. And Jesus makes this very clear. He came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. So the reason why I wouldn't do it today is because under that covenant, there was need to fulfill holiness. There was a need of the law to be upheld, because at that point in time, and Paul references this, or I should say the writer of Hebrews references this, but Paul does as well in his doctrines, that was the imperfect, and they sacrificed cattle to atone for sins, to achieve forgiveness, to escape God's judgment. But those animals were not perfect. They were tainted. And the sacrifice we have in Christ is a perfect sacrifice, and that judgment is fulfilled. When Christ said he fulfilled the law, that is one of the fulfillments that he did. He was the perfect sacrifice. And this is alluded to in the Old Testament in many, many areas, but I'm just going to choose one section in the Old Testament, and then I'll choose one in the New Testament to reference this, because I think they fit perfectly together. But this is a very popular verse, Isaiah 53, verse 5 and 6, speaking forward of the future, the Messiah who would come and who would be that perfect sacrifice. Isaiah says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions," speaking of the Messiah. "He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Now listen to this. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. What is being prophesied is that when the Messiah comes, that judgment that God executed on the Canaanites, including their innocent children, that judgment that God executed on the firstborn of Egypt, that judgment that God executed on those that were swallowed by the flood in Noah's day, that judgment that God executed even on Israel in their captivity by the Babylonians and by the Assyrians, that judgment that God regularly executed back in those days was because of man's sin. And what the prophet tells us here is that in the future, our sin will be laid upon the Messiah. He will be pierced for our transgressions. He'll be punished for our sins. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. We are, within this covenant with God, fulfilled the obligation of holiness through Christ. And there is no longer that judgment that would be given to someone over a heathen nation the way many would do. Again, speaking of the terrorists, those more of a Muslim faith that believe that they should execute judgment over an ungodly people, that's not their place. Not in Judeo-Christianity, where this original command came from. Because in Judeo-Christianity, the future Messiah would be the one to take on that punishment, not the people any longer. Colossians, Paul says, and this now goes to the New Testament to explain this in hindsight. We saw the forward or the foresight of Isaiah, and Paul in hindsight reflects on the crucifixion. And he states, when you were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive with Christ. He forgave us all our sins, having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness. This is what I was referring to. Having canceled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us. He has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. So the reason I can say with certainty that God will not command us to kill anyone, the innocent, the heathen, anyone nowadays, is because that punishment was paid for all mankind, once and for all. Isaiah saw it coming, and Paul reflected on it happening. And they both pointed to the same event, which was why it was so important, and it is such a significant event in history, that when we say Jesus died for our sins, that means that judgment that God executed on non-believers, that God executed on the Canaanites, that God executed on the Egyptians, that God executed on those innocent children, that God executed on those in Noah's flood, was put upon Christ. And he was now the atonement, the sacrifice, the payment for all of the sins that mankind would do. And now moving forward, we now walk under that covenant, under that covering, under that security, that it is no man's place to execute that judgment, because God will not require of us what he's already fulfilled and what he's already required and fulfilled of himself, which was that execution on the cross. And there will be a day when men will be judged for their belief. There will be a day when we all will stand before God, what Revelation refers to as the white throne judgment. And we touched on this a little bit last week in that segment with Scott, but maybe not enough. But there will be a day that we'll all have to account for where do we place our faith? Who is our representative? Who is our punishment for our sins? Is it upon us, or are we covered by Christ's grace? Have we accepted him as the coverer, as the one who has paid the price for that judgment that will come upon all mankind? Or are we looking to do it by our own way? Or are we just completely ignorant of that, or defiant to that, and not willing to even acknowledge it and not care? Either way, it's either you're covered under Christ and the punishment that he took upon all mankind that they would deserve for their sin, or you're not. And so nowadays, if someone were to tell me that they heard God tell them to kill other people, number one, I would say it must align with the reason why God did it in the Old Testament, which in every single case was an execution of judgment. And number two, that judgment was already taken care of at the cross. That payment was already paid at the cross. So they do not hear from God. They've heard from something else, but it definitely is not the God of the Bible. Because now under Christ, there is therefore no reason for anyone to execute God's judgment over anyone for any circumstance. That's one of the key doctrines or positions of the cross and the effectiveness of what Christ's atonement does for us. So I want to be clear on that, because it is a very serious thing. And I know that, people do these things because they hear from God, but they absolutely are not hearing from God. And I do not support that. And there is no circumstance that could happen today where someone would be justified and correct. And I will argue with anybody about that point. But they are not hearing from God. They're hearing from something else, because God's method of that judgment is dealt with through the cross. It's no longer dealt with over killing innocent children or some situation to that extent. So thank you for the email, Kelly. I am very glad that you reached out to me for that. Anybody that has questions, please, contact me, email me. You can get a hold of me through johnchristy.com. Or Facebook or anything like that. I'm more than happy to elaborate. I apologize that I didn't go into that depth when I had Scott on the call or on the show, and I wish I did. But I've tried to set it straight here and now, and hopefully Kelly, amongst others that listened and were bothered, hopefully you're listening, and I've made myself clear. So. Anyway, let's get to today's show. And my guest today, again, his name is John Wise. And as a professor of philosophy and 25 years as an atheist, it was in 2019 that John returned to Christianity as the more rational vision. Both John and his wife Jenny have devoted themselves to proclaiming truth as best as they can. Their podcasts, titled The Christian Atheist and Simple Gifts, are designed to raise the level of Christian understanding of the rationality of their faith and to reach out to agnostics and atheists who are honestly seeking the truth. John has been interviewed by Justin Brierley of Unapologetic. He's been on the David C. Smalley podcast, my friend David. He's been on Michael Wiseman's Of the Bible Says What podcast, and Jana Harmon's of the C.S. Lewis Institute's Side B podcast. So John and I have quite a bit in common, it sounds like, and I'm looking forward to speaking with him. So John Wise, the Christian Atheist, I'll bring you on and welcome you to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on, John.
Great. How are you doing?
Fantastic. Happy to be here. Interested to hear how our conversation goes and the email that you dealt with there in the beginning. I too was listening a little bit to that podcast today and was interested because Kant is one of the huge influences in my philosophical career.
Okay. Yeah, that email kind of hit me. I was like, wow, I do listen to all the podcasts afterwards, and and any other ones that I've been on, and there's always things where you look back and you say, oh, I wish I said this different. I wish I said that. I didn't explain that enough. There's always that critique, and several of them at times. But this one, when it hit me, I thought, man, I really screwed that up. I should have taken the time at the end to really address that and go there with Scott. Because when I went back and listened to it, and it was after I'd gotten this email, I heard it in Scott's voice that he was upset or he was troubled by it as well. And that fear, that feeling of, how do we know? God could just command people to, or people could believe God is commanding them to kill and do that. And we're not going to escape that. People hear things and do things, but I can absolutely defend that they are not hearing God. And the more that we need to let people know that and make sure that people are aware of that is not something of God. And, but I'll leave that.
I always
go ahead.
I get lots of emails on my stuff too, and on YouTube. So we have a YouTube channel as well that you can pick up, the Christian Atheist, No Compromise. No Compromise is our sub podcast underneath the Christian Atheist level, in which Jenny and I talk about issues from the Christian Atheist, but it's all under the Christian Atheist label. And then Simple Gifts is a separate podcast. But all of that content is available on our YouTube channel as well.
Okay. So let's start there. Bring me up to speed on, we talked a little bit about your background, but how did you become the Christian Atheist?
The first time I heard that phrase, the Christian Atheist, was while I was still an atheist. And it was Jordan Peterson. I was listening to his lectures on Genesis, and I found them extremely fascinating. And I had been an atheist for 25 years at that point. And it was sort of intriguing me back into the biblical text in a way that was new and rich, and that I'd been bored to my skull with when I was a Christian and had pretty much left behind, like I said, for 25 years. So Jordan Peterson sort of intrigued me back, and I thought to myself, you know what? One of the things I had learned in the last 2 or 3 years of my atheism was that an awful lot of what I believed still was Christian in the background. I still was fascinated and adored Jesus Christ as an ideal. I didn't believe he was God. I thought he was just another man. The whole atheist trope there that runs along with who Jesus was for most atheists.
Wait a minute.
And
I have to pause you there. Sorry. As an atheist, you still saw value in Jesus's teachings and Jesus as an ideal?
Sure did. Yep.
Okay, you got to go into that a little bit before you move on, because I've never heard that. Most atheists, and I've spoken to a lot of atheists, once they go down that path, even start to get to the point where they completely even reject his teachings, they find fault with them. So please elaborate.
Sure. I mean, it's not really historically a surprising position. Thomas Jefferson and most of the deists in the early part of the United States and during the Enlightenment were all fascinated with Jesus the man and held him up as a moral ideal. And so, having grown up in a Christian background, I had come to love Jesus as a Christian for the first 25 years of my life. And basically, my life falls apart into those two 25-year stretches. 25 years as a Christian growing up, and then 25 years as an atheist when I turned the corner. So even as I moved forward through my atheism, I always had a deep respect for Jesus and even for Christians. I liked Christians. My wife at that time was a Christian, and I would go to church with her. I just thought Christians were kind of quaint and cute and deceived, but good people for the most part. In fact, I came to understand as an atheist that if I had to choose between a group of people to pal around with, the Christians ended up being a better group. They were nicer. They were more solidly moral. And I have to be careful there because there is a lot of moralism within the atheist community. But yeah, I mean, to your point, most of the atheists I know would have actually been perhaps not as vehement as myself in their appreciation of Jesus, but most of them were not openly contemptuous about Jesus the man. Certainly some of the claims in the in the New Testament, like in particular when I was talking with David Smalley, they keep coming back to this. So how do you get from there to the Jew flying up into the sky?
Right.
And so, yeah. So it doesn't seem to me like it is an odd thing, but of course it wouldn't, because that was kind of my entire atheist experience. I was never at any point was I contemptuous towards the Lord.
So let me ask this, because okay, if not toward the Lord, the other part of this that's surprising to me is, you're mentioning things like quaint, solidly moral, and nice as referring to Christians, where again, what I get most from atheists is more of a militant attitude of, and it has to do with the political spectrum, because Christians are trying to push their beliefs on us. They're trying to control us. They're trying to force us to worship the way that they do. They're trying to, fill in the blank. But you didn't see it that way, or did you see it that way? It doesn't sound like it.
No. In fact, I was the one who would stand up for Christians in the academic circles as well, because there was an awful lot of contempt in the academy, and I mean other professors, other graduate students. I remember one particular meeting that we had that I got very incensed at, where one of the graduate students stood up and said, "What do we do with these fundies in our classes?" And the fundamentalist Christians.
Sure.
And I was just, it's the one class of people that we are encouraged in academia to have nothing but contempt for. And so I was incensed by that. And when I was teaching at East Stroudsburg University, as an adjunct professor, I'd been there for several years, and a new adjunct was brought on, and he was teaching Intro to Philosophy. And some of my former students came to me and said, "You know what he said to us on the first day? He said, if you come into my class a Christian, you're going to leave an atheist." And I was furious, because philosophy is not about shutting things down. It's about opening things up. And so I found most of what was happening in academia to be antithetical to the values that I found important in the liberal tradition of the Western world. And I still think that's the case. But if I can just pick up on one point
Sure.
of something that you said there, the hostility that you see in atheists today, I think is much more recent than you might be aware of. I'm not sure how old you are. I was born in 1966. And so I'm 57, love?
I'm just right behind
I'm 56.
you. I'm 51, so not far.
Okay,
behind.
so you're okay, not too far behind, but enough far behind because actually you're closer to my wife's age, and we've noticed a difference in the teaching in the school that she went through versus what I did. I was still catching some of the early 20th century flavors coming through. And by the time the 1970s rolled around, there was almost an entirely new teaching regime. And wow, okay, I'm opening too many cans of worms here all at once. But I've spent most of my career actually tracing out the origins of the failures of the Western world and why we're in the process of committing suicide right now. But I would say that the hostility that you're seeing is much newer in the atheist community, ever since the new atheists, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, have come out. I think there has developed an increasingly hostile, militant atheism that wasn't there nearly so much before that.
And what would you say is the leading cause of that? At least, amongst. Well, I'll leave it at that. What would you say is the leading cause of that? Why do you see that change?
Of the new militancy?
Yeah.
In Ernest Hemingway's book, The Sun Also Rises, there is a point where one of the characters says to another one, how did your finances, how did you go broke? And the other guy responded, well, in two ways. First, slowly, and then suddenly. And that's what's happened. And when I say I've been researching this most of my academic career, it all started, as I view it, most radically, not that there weren't roots going back farther, but Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in the 1830s is the origin of all this. His most famous pupil, of course, is Marx. And Marx laid the foundation through the 20th century that has systematically undermined and secularized our mind in the West to such an extent that we have abandoned the fundamental truths of the Western world, and we're living off of what Nietzsche would call the corpse of God. We are now surviving in the Western world because we have the sort of structures in place, the Judeo-Christian structures that have brought our world to the extent that we have now almost eliminated poverty, right? Think of science, the birth of science from Christianity. All of those things are a product, I believe, of the Spirit of Christ having inhabited our culture for so long. And we are now systematically taking it apart by undermining all of those structures, including the structures of science. One of the things that drives me absolutely insane today is to hear leftists talking about follow the science when they have systematically undermined the science in almost every way possible.
I have to say amen to that right there. We'll come back and talk about that more, but amen to that. Go ahead.
I mean, you asked me to trace it. It's like I've spent my whole lifetime doing that, and I've tried to build a lot of that into the Christian Atheist podcast, and we're almost to our 100th episode now. We just recorded 97 on Monday this week.
Wow, congratulations.
So we're 3 away from our 100th episode, and we've come a long way. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a labor of love. It hasn't yielded any much of any remuneration, but it's been absolutely fantastic. And that's why Jenny and I are doing it. When we got married and I came back to Christ, we said to ourselves, or Jenny said to me, I don't want you doing all of these other things. I want you to be able to do what you love to do, what stimulates you, and what serves the Lord. And I said, that's it. That's what we'll do. And so we founded the Christian Atheist, and it's evolved since then into what it is today. It's grown, but we still don't even have 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. And I think a lot of that is because it's such difficult content. And I scare people away by doing podcasts like a podcast series on Hegel that lasts for 10 episodes. And nobody ever reads Hegel anymore or has any idea what I'm talking about.
So the brilliance.
I'm sorry, I wandered afield there.
No, that's fine. I was just about to pull you back on. But that's good. You were saying some really good things, and I was taking some notes of things I want to touch on, ask you some questions toward. But one of the things I was just going to mention, as you were just talking there about Hegel and basically, that conversation and how deep theology is. C.S. Lewis always, I use him as a reference. I read his materials time and again. I actually have them not only as book, but as audiobooks or being read, of him as audiobooks. And what's so impactful to me about him is he took the most complex theological points or philosophical points, theology as part of philosophy, and he broke them down so simplistic. And that's something, I always think that's what I want to be like in whether it's talking on the podcast or if I'm writing or anything, is, I want to try to make it more simple and understandable. And it gets hard because we get used to so many phrases and words and these concepts that we understand, and then we just kind of put them out there and lose people. And I really strive toward that. And, one of the things that I've tried to do in a sense, learning from Lewis, is how he used his technique of basically just kind of relating it to an everyday occurrence or an everyday story or something that people would recognize very easily. And then he could draw out the real deep meaning in that. And he had made this comment, I'm not sure if it was Mere Christianity, but about atheism. He refers to it as a schoolboy's philosophy. And the reason...
I believe that's in Surprised by Joy.
Is it? Okay. And the reason behind that is because on the surface, it's, it seems like it stands up. It seems like it's a good argument until you start really digging deep at it and you start thinking it through. And the more you think through this philosophy, it loses itself. It loses its legs. It has no depth. It runs into dead ends that it really doesn't have an answer for. And it doesn't have any solid progression in its line of thinking because really it becomes rendered to nonsense. You have to at some point start justifying what I would call a lie in order to beat the truth. And, I've often said to my kids in talking about this or even other people, one of the reasons I'm not afraid to debate or talk, have conversation with non-believers, even if they have multiple PhDs and a lot more education than me and they've studied up in these fields, is because I've done enough of studying to really be convinced through it and logically convinced so that I can articulate it, why I believe that Christianity is the truth. And it's a lot easier to defend the truth than it is to promote a lie. And
exactly.
And that's why they have to be smarter than me, because I'm not smart enough to do that level. They claim Christians jump through hoops with things and there's not enough logic or ability to reason to justify, non-existence becoming existence, or, many of these types of thoughts and theories that are part of naturalism or atheism. And it's much easier to explain things according to how they are biblically as a theology, not necessarily that whether or not the story actually happened or it's a metaphor or it's an epic or whatever it may be, but just, what's the truth in that passage you're reading? And to defend that is so much easier to do because it's true and it makes sense in the most simplistic explanation and it makes sense in the most complex theological dissertation. Yes. So go ahead. I'll let you respond.
Runs the whole gamut.
It does.
That's right. The gospel is from the most simple person on the face of the planet can grasp it, understand it, and come to faith in Christ. And you can take it all the way up to the other end of the intellectual spectrum. It runs the whole gamut and everything in between, and it doesn't miss a beat at any level. It is the only system that fits all the parts together. Atheism, as you said, assumes things that it can't justify. And it has these self-deceptive structures all through it. I came out from the bathroom today, right before we began our podcast, and I said to my wife, we should write a book called Mere Atheism. And I should run through the doctrines that atheists have to believe in order to be atheists and show how they are deceiving themselves at every level along the way. And I like to say, following up on something you just said there, I never call myself an apologist. All I do, I'm essentially a finger. I point to the truth. And the truth will either convince you or you'll reject it. But the truth remains the truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But all we need to do as Christians, and I tell this at every level when I get this question from college students, I can't do what you do. You don't have to do what I do. Point to the truth. Jesus is the truth. And he wins because he is the Logos. He is reason itself. And we don't ever have to be ashamed of that because it's the truth. And it is completely rational. And we've lost that in today's world. People say, oh, science has made God irrelevant. No, it hasn't. There is absolutely nothing in science or mathematics or in philosophy. Of course, there's philosophers, individual philosophers. But there is nothing that points away from God other than man's reasoning, his false reasoning.
So I want to get into some of those things with you in a little bit. But before we do, I want to take a step back, and I want to understand. You were a Christian, then you became an atheist, and you went back to being a Christian. So can you tell me a little bit about what Christianity was to you the first time, and then we can talk about the atheism again. But then I want to understand what was different, on both sides. What caused you to really go from Christian to atheist? And then what really caused you, if you can narrow it down enough, to go from atheist to Christian, and what was different about your Christianity?
Okay. So we're only going to be able to touch on little brief things on this. So if anybody is really interested in this, they should go to the podcast. The first 10 podcasts tell the story in pretty good detail. And we also have a book called Through the Looking Glass, The Imploding of an Atheist Professor's Worldview, available on Amazon, which also tells the story quite well and greater depth than we can here. But I grew up in a Christian household. My mother was an evangelical Christian. My father was an agnostic. And so I had those two influences growing up. And I went to Bible college out of high school to become a pastor. And I started studying philosophy in Bible college. Now, some people say that it was the philosophy that took me away. I don't think so. I began studying on my own philosophy and other things in Bible college. And by the time I graduated, I was well on my way towards agnosticism. And the best I can do to explain the transition, why it happened, was that I tried to be a Christian. And I found myself trying to convince myself that this was true, rather than believing it was true.
So when you say,
college,
sorry, just interject a little bit.
Go ahead, yeah.
So when you say trying to be a Christian, you meant maybe did you mean you hadn't looked into it? You didn't read the Bible enough, understand the theology enough, the doctrine enough to truly believe it?
No,
or
it wasn't
what
that.
do you mean?
No. So when I was like 6 years old, I made a decision for Christ. And as my wife will tell you today, I never do anything halfway. So I was all in. And so I would, when I was in Bible college, I was like leading the pack in evangelism. I spent time on the streets of New York and Philadelphia and Kingston, Jamaica. So I was out there doing everything that I thought was the right thing. And it became so overwhelming for me psychologically that it felt more, it's not that I didn't understand it. I think I understood it too well, and I couldn't hold on to it. I didn't know that it was the truth. And I think I was looking for a level of certainty that I couldn't find from any of my professors, any of the books that I read, any of the practices I was engaging in. And so I thought to myself, okay, this philosophy stuff, I love this. I'm a huge fan of science. I'm going to depend on them to help me find the truth. And so I switched from Christianity, not really explicitly, but just in my mind, I went from that to thinking, okay, I'm not sure what the truth is. Maybe it's Christianity, maybe it's not. But if it is Christianity, when I study, everything's going to point in that direction, and I'll find the truth, and everything will be hunky-dory. Well, it didn't. And I went to graduate school then to study philosophy, because it probably wasn't, after graduating Bible college, it's probably not a good idea to try to become a pastor when you're an agnostic, right? Most congregations prefer that you actually believe in God. So I decided to pursue philosophy. And in the first year of my graduate school, I was walking across campus, and I said to myself, no, agnosticism, as C.S. Lewis would have said, is cowardice. Right? You're standing on the edge of something. You're standing in the wood between the worlds. And that's a sleepy place where nothing gets accomplished. Jump into one of the pools. Either get back into Christianity or theism, or become an atheist. And so I said, okay, there's no God. And that was the beginning of my atheism. I just stopped. And for 25 years, that was where I stood.
So when you were in graduate school, what was your PhD in? Or what is
Philosophy.
your PhD in? Philosophy.
It's in philosophy.
And what was your dissertation?
My dissertation was called Jean-Paul Sartre's Phenomenological Ontology and the German Idealist Tradition.
Wow. So in a simplistic way, can you explain in a very abstract what that was about?
Sure. Well, Jean-Paul Sartre is a 20th century existentialist atheist. And his major work, Being in Nothingness, is in the phenomenological German idealist tradition. And so I immersed myself in studying that tradition, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Marx, Edmund Husserl, some Heidegger, and then Sartre at a level beyond any of them. And I immersed myself in that tradition, studied it intensely, and received all kinds of really interesting things now that I'm a Christian looking back, realizing God was leading me in the path that he was leading me and teaching me things through all of that philosophical investigation. But the point of my dissertation was to make the point that Jean-Paul Sartre, this atheistic existentialist, was siding with Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German idealist. And the way in which he was siding with Kant is in favor of the ethical enterprise that Hegel had undermined. And so all of that played into my return to Christianity. And I try to lay this out at an understandable level, as I said, in those first 10 episodes of the podcast. But it was an intensely philosophical journey.
So let me ask you, before we get to coming back to Christianity, in going from Christianity to atheism, do you see that it was the philosophy, the literature, that the topics you were studying that kind of drew you out of Christianity, or were you gravitating towards those because you believed in them more? Does that make sense? Were you going towards it, or were you being pulled out of it, is what I'm curious about.
Was I going towards atheism, or was I being pulled out of Christianity?
Yes. Am I making sense by asking it that way?
Yeah. It's never been put to me in quite that way before. So we're kind of looking for the push-pull issue.
Yeah. Because often the reason why I ask that is because, I myself think over the course of my life, and I question my own learning and knowledge, and thinking of, do I gravitate towards Christianity because, in a sense, I'll say it this way, because I want it to be true, or by studying it so deeply have I found it to be true? And so that's what I'm kind of curious. Did you want atheism to be true and you went towards it, or were you comfortable and it just shook you and it pulled you?
I don't think that there was either a push or a pull, other than, and this is how I explained it in the podcast too, I wanted to know the truth. And I say in the podcast, I formulated for myself, when I became an atheist, a simple dictum: truth above all and at all costs. And if that means turning away from what I grew up with in Christianity, then I said, that's a price I'm willing to pay. And it seemed to me as though that was the proper direction at the time. When I look back at it now, I think there was also almost a Ruth type motivation, right? I had changed. I'd walked out of the Christian world and I'd been there, done that. And now I was a part of the academic world. And so there was a new God and a new series of doctrines in which I needed to, saturate myself and follow. And so I needed to do that. And this actually ties into something you said a little while ago about atheism, and most atheists don't follow where it goes. I was committed to following it where it went. I wanted to see what the logic of atheism would yield. And I found at the end, right, at the end of my dissertation, and as I was teaching as a professor afterwards, I traced that logic, and it led me ultimately to a place that was no more certain than my Christianity was, right, when I left Christianity. And so I was left with these two rational visions, Christianity and atheism, and I had to choose between the two of them.
So let's pause there, because there's one more thing I want to ask you before you got to that point, and then we'll continue back on. If you can kind of go back to your mindset when you were the atheist. I know many Christians that would respond to you, if they came to your campus and, with Campus Crusades for Christ or whatever it may be, Veritas, and they were witnessing, being evangelical, and talked to you, and you told them you used to be a Christian and now you're an atheist, and this was the direction you went, and you had these philosophical reasons, and this was what you were studying, they would say, well, you most likely never had a true relationship with Christ, relationship with God before. How would you respond to that then, and what is your insight nowadays?
I'm laughing because it's funny. I get that from both sides now.
Yes.
Christians will tell me, oh, well, you weren't a Christian in the first place. And atheists will tell me, oh, you were never an atheist.
Yeah, no true Scotsman.
So, yeah. And I guess in their own way, the atheists are right. I think I never really gave up. Even through graduate school, when I look back on it now, my defense of the Christians in our classrooms and against the academic culture, I think was a way in which I was, in a backdoor manner, trying to serve God. And I mean that in two ways, because God ultimately is truth. I mean, that's one of the superlatives by which we describe him. And so in an unconscious way, when I said my principle is truth above all and at all costs, that was, in its own way, a way to serve God. And this is why I say to this day that atheism seems to me, if it's honestly pursued, one of the clearest paths to Christ. Because, and C.S. Lewis actually says this in Mere Christianity too, right? When a sincere Christian youth stops going to church because he does not believe in the doctrines or the things that are being said, and he does it because he's honestly pursuing what he thinks is right, he is probably closer at that moment to the Spirit of Christ than he's ever been.
Absolutely.
And I agree with that. And because God is truth, I think I was really trying to serve God. And I think I was also hiding from myself that I wanted to serve God. And it was an odd, I mean, to this day I can still cry. If I'm going to associate myself with a biblical character, probably Judas is as close as it gets. Because I really did turn my back on God. I betrayed him. And I feel that deep in my soul. So maybe the atheists are right. Maybe I never was an atheist. But you know what? I think the vast majority of people today who are atheists, for instance, Richard Dawkins is holding on to God as much as he denies it, because Richard Dawkins believes in the truth, the reality, the absolute reality of truth. And if you're pursuing an absolute truth, you are at some level pursuing God.
I'll tell you this. In my relationship with David Smalley, there have been so many times in talking with him off the air, off the podcast, even on the podcast, I'll say, but you know, in conversations where just the line of questioning, it sounded more to me like he believed in God than he did not believe in God. And
I agree.
You know, and he would say to me, and I think I've even said that to him before, and he would have a response of, you know, something towards the direction of, you know, it's not that I believe, it's that I'm trying to understand, you know, if this God really existed. But, and I'm sorry to sound, you know, so lack of evidence and based on feeling, but it is that sound in the voice, that emotion, that passion, that something where you say, this is more than just an intellectual practice you're doing right now. It's interesting. So let me ask you this then. Looking back, would you say we'll call it your first Christian experience? Will you look back now and say you were saved then?
Yes.
Okay. So,
yep,
because
sure.
As you were telling me that about, you know, you turned your back on God, the story of the prodigal son was in my mind, and I'm thinking that's exactly what that is. You know, it doesn't have to be that you went out and did the booze, you know, wine, women, and song necessarily, but you basically went away from your father, and you said, I'll do it on my own, and you eventually, to some extent, came to your senses, and in your mind, you had thought, well, I've turned my back on God, where with the understanding of that story, the parable, God never saw it as that. God saw it as you were not with him anymore, but not that you turned your back on him, that you were still his child, that you still got the ring, you still got the robe, you still had the position, you still had the place. So, you know, that just giving you my insight into the story, I think that's very interesting what you went through, and that you're honest enough. You were honest then, and you're honest enough now to be able to reflect on that and say, you know, I think I was still seeking God as an atheist because I was seeking truth. That's very insightful.
Something came to my mind when when you were talking about David Smalley. When I did my interview with him, at one point in our conversation, I said to him, the greatest argument, and the argument that keeps coming back in like 4,000 different terms, 4,000 different variations, the greatest argument for atheism is the problem of evil. Right? This is a problem that we've struggled with in the Christian world, in the theist world, honestly, for thousands of years. Have we answered it fully yet? No, I don't think we have. But we've struggled honestly with it. And he didn't miss a beat. He said, no, the greatest argument for atheism is the absence of God. And boy, that has hung with me ever since. It's that he wants to find God, but he can't find him. And that's the problem of faith, because we don't walk by sight anymore. I mean, that's what the angels do. We walk by faith. And once you make the switch, finding God isn't the problem. He's everywhere. And that's why I say I'm not an apologist. All I have to do is point. The Western world is suffused with God everywhere we look. All the world around us, in science, in literature, God is there. And he's there in our personal lives as well.
That's so good. And the way I've seen this, the example I've used, and it sticks with me. We got to go back to the 90s. And every mall that you went in at the time had those stochastic, really digitized, pixeled, just array of colors and static. It was a stochastic screening on these portraits, and it would have different colors, and you were supposed to stare at it.
I know what you're talking about.
And if you stared at it long enough and in the right way, or like you blurred your eyes, or you blurred everything around you, and however it was, at some point you would see the image, and it would be like a 3D model of a ship or something, or butterfly, whatever it was. Right. That's exactly how I see it. Is you don't see it until you can see it, and once you see it,
the Gestalt switch.
Well, is that the name of the image, or
the Gestalt switch? Yeah, it's that idea that suddenly something snaps into focus that before you couldn't see.
Yeah, and you see this a lot with memes on the internet. It'll be like a picture, and once you see, the man's arm is really a horse, you never unsee it. Things like that, or whatever it may be.
Right.
But that's what I always think of, is those images, because I think, and on one, and to me, it's so insightful, because on one hand, there's a level of concentration, there's a level of focus, there's a level of seeking after it. You can walk by those, and it just looks like 10 or 12 different weird images that you just pass by and don't even pay attention to. But if you focus, and you focus on one of them, and you work at it, and you seek it, and you want to see it, you'll start seeing it. And the person right next to you could say, I don't see it. And you're saying, but you can't see it. Yep. I can see it now. And they're saying, I still can't see it. I'm looking at the same image. I'm doing the same thing, and I don't see it. And you're like, oh man. And then all of a sudden you're not seeing it now because you lost focus. And then you hear them, all of a sudden, their excitement, and they're like, oh, I see it now. Or they got a glimpse of it. And I don't know. That's what I've always thought of. Yeah, exactly. And it's so relevant to me, because to me, that is the gospel. That is God. I mean, that's not the gospel, but that's how we see it. When it resonates with us, when we catch it, and we get excited, and we do have to, unfortunately, some more than others have to work, in a sense, at finally seeing God, and for many different reasons. Some of just our own ways, our own depravity, our own selfishness, our own blinders, our own distractions, focus on many other things around there, whatever it may be. But then when we get it. And unfortunately, some never do. And they stop trying, and they start making excuses for why there is no image there. And it's in your mind. And it's, so I found that to be interesting. Go ahead.
in having discussions with atheists, I constantly get, well, show me the evidence. Where's the evidence? Give me the evidence. Show me the evidence.
Right.
And so I did a series on the Christian Atheist called The Evident Evidence and Faith. And I made the point that, and I always came back to the atheist, I finally learned how to deal with it. I said, okay, what sort of evidence would you count as evidence for God? And when you force them to look at it, there is no evidence that you can give them that would be evidence for God, because they've started already with a position that there is no God, and therefore there can be no evidence for him. We can explain away any evidence that we have for anything. It is part of our ability as human beings, as rational creatures, to be able to give multiple accounts for what is given to us in terms of causality and all of the other things. This is something I learned in my dissertation work, right? Metaphysics is the realm of faith. And how we explain things, we're going to have to choose one of those stories, the way that we explain it. And if you've already decided in advance, and this is what they never admit to, but if you've already decided in advance that there is no God, you will never find evidence for him, ever. It's not possible, because you've excluded the possibilities from the start.
Yeah.
And that's one of those self-deceptive structures. And I say we can actually move back from evidence to a more basic level of grasping things. And this is also something I learned from Jean-Paul Sartre and phenomenology, and say, okay, there are basic experiential things that human beings deal with. And those basic things, from just those basic things, we can find evidence for God, because those things point beyond the world that we live in to something bigger and better and, in a sense, outside of this world, because they're the superlatives of God. And it's the superlatives that actually anchor human reasoning. So without God, without these ideals with which we think, we have no rationality.
Yeah, and a lot of what I hear is, naturalistic explanations for what we would deem as miracles or events. And and the interesting part that I always come back to there is we are in, limited natural capacity. We live in a natural world.
Right.
That's, case in point, that's the reason why God became flesh, condescended to being a human, and coming down to our terms to speak to us, to reach us, to minister, to reveal himself to us physically. So operating in that realm is what you would expect for him to do. So many of the things that are of God, when they can somewhat at least be rationalized or explained by natural events, are because, they're within the natural world. That's where the agents are. That's where they need to be. So of course they would be that way.
Exactly. Why wouldn't God use the natural world to serve his needs?
Exactly. And that's the world he created.
Changing of water to wine.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's if he did things that we had no understanding of in the natural world that we know, we couldn't even comprehend it. We couldn't even understand it. We couldn't even, because we only can know what we know. And he has to deal with that limited capacity of knowledge. Eventually, someday, as Paul states, we'll see more clearly, and we'll have maybe better insight, and we'll be exposed to many things. But when John catches his vision of Revelation, or Ezekiel catches his visions, the best they can do is describe it to us in natural terms, things that they say it's like, it looks, but it's not quite what it is. And I can't even explain any further, So things happening God working in the natural. For example, I never discount the ability of God to reach us and deal with us through our emotions. That's part of what we're created for, is to use our emotions, and God deals with us in that. Experience is one of the greatest evidences we have personally of God's existence. Feelings, the relationship, it's what I have the greatest evidence of my relationship with my wife, more than the marriage license and more than the names on our mortgage that we hold. It's the feelings, it's the experience, it's the personal things. Those are harder things to evidence to people. I can evidence our mortgage signing. I can evidence our marriage license. It's harder to evidence the intimacy, the love, the bond we feel. But that makes complete sense with God. And so if we don't expect to see God in the natural and only think he's in the supernatural, I think we misunderstand God. And while he is in the supernatural, he is in the metaphysical, he's very much in the physical. And again, that's what Christ on earth came to show us. So this is going great. I'm really enjoying talking with you, and it's very interesting, a lot of the insights that you have. And so I want to delve a little bit into, let's talk a little bit about philosophy and science, and then I'd like to kind of just propose to you some counter arguments. I'll be the atheist for a little bit, and I want to hear some of your responses to things. But
sure.
Let's first talk about philosophy and science. Can they work together, not just exist together? Can they be in harmony together?
Philosophy and science?
Yes. Sure.
I think science actually is a fairly new term. It used to be called natural philosophy. And so I think one grew out of the other. And I don't think, I think there are some things that have happened in philosophy that science has pretty much, proved wrong. Like there were the theories of some of the theories of the pre-Socratics were that the world is made up of the four elements. And we know that that's not right. Water, earth, fire, and air. We know that that's not right. Those four components, they made a pretty darn good philosophical, rational explanation for it. And yet science has proven that explanation to be essentially wrong. But I think that is one of the elements of science that really makes it Christian, because it believes that there are actual answers to the questions, that truth really is out there, and that's what we're pursuing. I don't think philosophy and science are in conflict, except when philosophy gets it wrong and science can correct it. But it seems to me that an awful lot of what is going on in astrophysics these days resembles philosophy more than it resembles, experimental science as we've become accustomed to look at it in its ideal form. Because when you start talking about strings and and brains, BRANES for short for membranes, and trying to explain how a particle or how an electron is both a particle and a wave at the same time. Now we're getting much more into the metaphysical realm than we are in the sort of hard empirical science realm that we've, been accustomed to think of science as. So I don't think they're at all in conflict with one another.
So, and you're absolutely right. As far as we say it's theoretical, but that's just a scientific term for we don't have anything physical to prove. Yeah, it's philosophical. It makes me think of the God particle, the Higgs boson, and the certainty that existed, even though it was never seen, it was never understood completely. It was theoretical for the longest time until it was revealed or proven.
Yeah, well, I loved that. And I love to use that as an argument, too, with atheists. In fact, I have a discussion with Tom Jump. Have you ever heard of Tom Jump?
No.
Okay, so he's a YouTuber who specializes in making Christians look like fools. So I went on his podcast, and by the end of it, he was pretty mad at me, I think, because I didn't give any ground. So that was fun. Now I lost my point. What was I going to say about that?
We were talking about the God particle. And just, okay, go ahead.
So with the Higgs boson, it's like, what allowed us to come to that conclusion? We were following the logic of the position that we've built and understood, and the rationality of the mathematics of what we understood so far about the nature of the physical world pointed to something that we had no evidence for, no empirical evidence.
Thus, the reason they called it the God particle.
Right. So we believed in it, right? In exactly that way. We believed in it, and then we found it. And I think there is a fundamental faith underlying theism as well. And I call it that in my podcast, the fundamental faith. And I think it starts with the distinction back all the way back in Genesis to Cain and Abel, and even before that in Satan. It starts with the notion that we live in a good world, just as it says in Genesis. God looked around at his creation and saw that it was good. And what is contained in that notion of good are all the superlatives of God: rationality, goodness, morality, truth, reason. All of those things are found in that. And if we start with that notion as the foundational notion, instead of believing that the world is deceptive and evil and something we can't trust, and all of that's given to us is merely phenomenal. But if we start the other point, we're going to find God, because ultimately everything is going to point to him. But if we don't choose to start there, we're never going to find him. Yeah. And I think those are the two fundamental starting points that every human being makes some choice of in their life. And I don't think we're often either purely Cain or purely Abel. I think we're almost always a mix of the two. And that's why, like with someone like Dawkins or David Smalley, I say, boy, there's an awful lot in them that makes them want to be a theist. And they're holding on to God at some level, but they refuse to see it as that. And I think even, go ahead.
Yeah. Isn't that in its most basic understanding of how you defined it, to say it simply that we must believe it's there, or we must at least be convinced that it's possible to exist, that we seek it. Isn't that the most basic premise of science in itself?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what is the use of science if you don't believe that you're pursuing truth? And in pursuing truth, you're pursuing value. They're one and the same.
I was just going to say, we launch satellites into deep space with the Beatles records and classical Mozart playing, and some version of a binary communication that we think just in the chance, because there's a possibility that there's other life, we're doing this. We don't do it because we're convinced that it doesn't exist. We have no real reason to believe that it exists, other than it just seems logical. It just seems based on everything else. If we exist, why shouldn't something else exist? You start sounding like you're using the same exact logic for why Christians would say, well, there must be a first cause because everything else has a cause. There must be intelligence in the universe because where else do we get numbers and equations and physics and things, and all these types of theories that we have. It's all the same exact thing. And even to the point, we mentioned PhDs. Scientists get PhDs, and that PH doesn't stand for prehistory or something else. It
No.
stands for philosophy, you know?
Exactly.
Their doctorates are in philosophy. So, I mean, you know, and obviously if you've heard me speak before, I absolutely believe in philosophy and science working together, but that's like one of the first things that, you know, you get pushback on, and particularly, again, the realm of theology, which is a branch of philosophy. That's where they push back. Religion and science don't coexist. They can't coexist. And it's absurdity. Some of the greatest scientists were very religious, and not just because that was the cultural thing to do at the time.
Yeah, in fact, I just read Descartes' Discourse on Method for our Simple Gifts podcast, and I've read his Meditations on First Philosophy for the same podcast. And Descartes makes, I mean, an incredibly powerful arguments for God. And so I've heard people try to explain it away. Well, it's just, you know, historically, of course, he had to say that, but he didn't really believe. Baloney, he didn't believe it.
Right.
We, in our secular culture today, we're trying to turn the rest of the world into mini versions of ourselves, instead of recognizing that actually they thought incredibly differently because they were grounded in the notion that there's a transcendental reality. And we've abandoned it. We've made everything immanent, which takes us back to that Hegel thing. This is the great contribution of Hegel to Western philosophy, to immanentize everything, to say there is nothing beyond the reality that we experience here and now in this world. So that's secularization.
Let me go down the path now of, I'll probe with a few, I'll ask from an atheist standpoint some questions, and I'd be curious to get your response and answers to these, because you know, these are the common things. I'm trying to use the most common questions or rebuttals that I seem to hear. So let me start with, we talked about the no true Scotsman. You know, you never really were an atheist, which is another one. And again, that does come from both sides, from the Christian and the atheist side. You know, each one always thinks if you've jumped ship, well, you never really were there anyway. So we won't go any further down that one, but let's look at a couple other common ones. Let's go first to, well, let's deal with the problem of evil. You know, if God really existed, why would he allow pain and suffering?
Because he wanted to give his creations free choice. And I mean, one of the first things I always do with atheists on all of the versions that they give me on this is to say, we Christians have been working on the problem of evil since Christianity came to be, and even before Christianity in the Old Testament, right? It's what we call the Judeo-Christian. We have not solved this problem. It is a problem that plagues. I can give you some pat answers, but pat answers didn't solve it for me when I was a Christian, which is part of the reason I transitioned over to atheism. So I have to tell atheists, I don't have the definitive answer for this. I have some things that help me get beyond it and still hold on to the God that I love. But I don't have a final answer for how it is that an all-powerful God couldn't create a universe in which evil had no place, other than the existence of free will. He wanted us to be able to love him back in a way in which the love was real. And therefore, when someone is free, they have the ability to accept or reject the goodness that God gives them. And when we reject that goodness, that's the emergence of evil. It is because goodness is everything. When God looked around in Genesis and he looked at his creation, it was all good. And so everything that exists is good. But because sin entered the world, there are all kinds of these things where good has become twisted. And it is those twistings, not the existence itself, that are evil. It is the twistings. It is the darkenings. Because goodness was what God created. And sin is the diminution of the light of God or the twisting of the reality of God. And that's the best I can do with it. And in terms of God and the judgment and all the other things that come in with the problem of evil, I think of the moment when Abraham was talking with one of the Christophanies when they were looking at Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham said, "Will not the God of all the earth do right?" And that is just what I rest in. It is part of that fundamental faith. God is good. And if there is evil, it's not because God put it there. It's because somehow or other it got twisted. And that's the best I can do.
Okay, so let me follow up on that then. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because I just saw this meme, I don't know, last week. If you saw a child being kidnapped or a child being molested, you would intervene, you would do something. But apparently God does nothing. So how can he still be good to stand by and watch something so horrific as that happen?
Yeah. See, this is like I try not to get trapped into these corners because, and this is like the Michael Wiseman trap. God allows human beings to be free. And that means that the world around us has to deal with the consequences of human freedom. And could God stop that? Yeah. Why doesn't he? I don't know. But God does. He's the one who's able to put together the infinite reality, the entire tapestry. And we see these little parts and think that we can manage to say that God did something wrong here. But that very freedom that we have to judge God was given us by God. And so we have to trust at some level, and this is the level that you decide either you're a theist or you're not, that God he's either there or he isn't. And if he's there, then you've got to deal with this problem of evil. And we've been trying to deal with it. Have I got all the answers? No. But I believe that God behind all of that is good. And we will agree with him when we see the whole picture that God has.
Yeah, and both of those are very disturbing and hard to answer, and they don't sit well with I don't think anyone, even the most theologically minded.
Yeah.
One of the things that well, just real quick, one of the things I do think of, I used to use Johnny Erickson Tada, if you're familiar with her, paraplegic, as an example, because she has said, as a paraplegic, if given the ability to have all my functions again, if Jesus said, "I will heal you," I would say no, thank you, because I've been able to reach so many people and change their thinking of who God is and what faith is because of my disability. And I always thought that was beautiful. But several years ago, when that story of the horrific monster Ariel Castro came out, if you remember, he was the one, I believe it was Wisconsin or somewhere, I'm not sure, maybe Chicago, where he had girls for years tied up as prisoners in his basement, and he would sexually abuse them. He had children, at least one child, I believe, with one of them, and for years he had them locked in his basement, and he did as he pleased, and abused them physically, sexually, mentally. And at one point, one of them somehow was able to escape, and that's how the whole story broke. And I'm not sure if it was Michelle Knight who was the one who escaped, but what I do remember is Michelle Knight was one of them. And she told of how he would tie her to the wall, suspended on the wall with electrical extension cords, and he would physically abuse her, beat her. He would sexually abuse her. He would come in at night and rape her. And it got to the point where there was no resistance, but it was still rape, clearly. But this was years and years of mental torment. And she said in an interview, I believe it was CNN or maybe it was Fox, I'm not sure, but it was like a popular news media. I think it was CNN in an interview. And she had said, she wouldn't go back and change anything because despite what she went through, the testimony it has given her of God's grace, his mercy, his comfort over her life is what she holds on to. And she, I can't even imagine to say those words as she said it, but to have lived through that and come out of that from that end with that perspective of basically I'm a vessel for God and God allowed this to happen to me, but what I see in this life is what I'm able to do to other victims, to girls that have been raped, to other people that haven't experienced nearly what I've gone through, and show the testimony of Jesus Christ. And, I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly what she said, but that's the gist of it. That's the mentality of it. And while I can't fully answer the why God does it, and I won't presuppose I know why, to hear stories like Johnny Erickson Tata or Michelle Knight and what they went through, and there's many more than them, says to me that maybe the problem of evil isn't quite the problem we think that it is. And that's. I think that's definitely the case.
Yeah. I mean, C.S. Lewis talks about that too in It's Not Surprised by Joy. It's A Grief Observed. He says, when we finally reach eternity, we're going to find out that many of the questions we asked and troubled ourselves with make no sense. It's kind of like asking what color is, wait, how do you say it, love? Is yellow a square or a circle, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that. It makes no sense. When you finally see the context and the reality, you're asking a nonsensical question. And I think the problem of evil might be like that. We just finished on the Christian Atheist a 7 or 8 part series on, may even be more than that, 9-part series on Milton's Paradise Lost. And at the end of that, in book 12 of Paradise Lost, after Adam has just gone through the horror of the fall, and having had recounted to him by the archangel Michael the history of man and all of the evil that will occur, he gets to the end, and Adam says, wow, out of all of this, God brought forth good. And I mean, that's like, it kind of reminds me of The Great Divorce. You had talked about C.S. Lewis earlier. And there's a scene in there when George MacDonald, who is his guide in heaven, one of the last things he says to C.S. Lewis as he's getting ready to leave heaven to come back to earth, I guess, he says, when we die and we go to eternity, the believer who has lived his life on earth as best he could as a believer finds himself in heaven. He recognizes that there was never a time when he wasn't in heaven. that eternity is just the recognition that God's goodness has suffused your life all through, and you've been in eternity all along. And he says it's the same for the unbeliever. For them, they will assume they will find that they've been in hell their whole life. Again, of course, that's meant, I think, to remind us of the dwarves in the last battle. Right? They're sitting inside inside of heaven. When it was the equivalent of heaven, Narnia. And they can't enjoy any of the goodness of God. Aslan tries to give them all the good food, and to them it tastes like straw and muddy water, because that's their mindset. And that, of course, takes us back to sorry, I keep going back to Milton's Paradise Lost. But in the beginning of Paradise Lost, Satan says the mind is its own place and can make a heaven of hell, or a hell of heaven.
Of heaven, yeah. Yeah, and from my personal experiences, I'm kind of disassociated from that line of thinking that blames all of man's free will actions, pain, harm, hurt, abandonment, punishment that we inflict on one another. I'm disassociated from that line of thinking where that, is God's fault. I don't know why, and I've really struggled at times with this because, I did not have that great of an upbringing. I had a father that was abusive, mentally, physically. He went to prison when I was 9 years old. And when he got out, it was, the same. I was older, so the physical no longer existed, but the mental, he didn't care for us. And I'm the youngest of 5, and all of my siblings went through this to some level. And I had my bitterness. It's not like I just brushed it off. There were years where I was very angry with him, bitter with him. He died in the late 90s, I guess, late 90s. Mm-hmm. And even after that, there was bitterness because, I couldn't wrap it up with him, either restoration or really finally put him in his place, or whatever it was. But I never associated that with God. I always saw it as it was him. It was his flaws. And on the flip side, I had an incredible mother. Maybe not the most affectionate by, Carol Brady standards or something, but very much a hard loving, and I mean hard loving as in she loved us thoroughly, and did everything and anything for us to give us the best of what she could and take care of us and never, abandon or whatever. She did she loved us enough for 2 or 4 parents. So maybe that's why, I didn't go that direction, because I saw both of it. I don't know, but when people immediately respond to these issues with a therefore there mustn't be a God, I really have a hard time following that line of thinking. I don't know.
Me too.
I'm stuck when it comes to that.
Yeah. No, for me, but I guess I understand why people sometimes go that way, why they blame God. But when I look around and I see people, to me, it's the fault of the people.
Yeah.
And it's my fault because I screw things up so often and so badly that I'm just bearing the consequences of my own stupidity, and willful disobedience.
Yeah.
And that seems to explain almost all of the bad things that happen to me.
Yeah, and if we would just stop, Francis Chan, what was that book, Crazy Love or something? And he's a good inspirational author, pastor. There's a part in there that he, it always stuck with me, that he says, there are those that would say to God, why is there hunger? Why is there rape? Why is there murder? Why is there crime? Why is there, all these bad things that we do to one another? And God has every right to look back to us and say, why is there rape? Why is there murder? Yes. Why is there crime? And that's the way really I see it is, it's on us. Like, why do we think it's not?
Yeah.
So,
no, I'm with you there for sure. Yep.
So staying a little bit with that topic, another common statement I hear from atheists and have heard is that, I'm good without God. And I don't mean good as in positionally. I mean, like, I'm a well-behaved, morally astute person. I take care of things. I do what's right and I do what's well, and I don't need a God and a book of rules to tell me what's good and what's well. I understand it based on humanity and humanism. Our care for one another, our seeking of the best for each other is much more powerful than some God in the sky dictating to us with his finger what we should eat and shouldn't eat and what we should do and should not do. So I don't need God to be good. How would you speak to that person? What would you say?
I would challenge whether or not they really believe they're good, because I think it's fundamental to human beings to recognize that they fall short of their own ideals. Every human being does. And if you're not willing to acknowledge that, then you're right. You don't need God. That's your position. That's your choice. But I don't think you're being honest with yourself. Because honesty with self is that I'm not so hot, actually. I've screwed so many things up, and some of it was by choice, some of it was just, circumstance. But I think every human being is born with a self-realization that they're not living up to their own ideals. So I would challenge it just on that level.
Yeah,
not that it works. I mean, you're right. I've run across atheists like that. Essentially, if they're committed to that, it's like Jesus said, I came to heal the sick. The healthy have no need of a doctor.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the fundamental starting points for turning to Christ, recognizing, I don't have it.
First, being able to maybe even define what is good, and not really in a highbrow philosophical way, but even just, again, and we just talked about this last week on the objective morality topic of, if morality is based upon an understanding of well-being, what is well-being and for whom? Because well-being for one may not be well-being for another, and the easy case in point for that is abortion. Well-being for the child in the womb is to thrive, to come to life, to experience this, world, and well-being for the mother who's making the decision is maybe something else, and those are in contradiction. So what is good in that situation?
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing, not to chase a rabbit hole, is one of the things I've noticed in recent years is how much that dynamic has switched now to there are more and more people, and especially I do notice it in the atheist camp. I noticed the striking similarities, I mean, just obvious now at this point, between the left, the liberal left, the extreme liberal left, and atheism. I mean, again, the follow the science, the talking points are out of the same manual. The positions are exactly identical now. It's very rare that I'll run into someone who's an atheist that is either independent or central or especially right-wing or conservative leaning even. And not to say that they don't exist, but the vast majority, it's as far left as you go. Their lack of belief in God seems to be teamed together in many ways. But the point that I was getting to on the abortion issue that I see so dominant, or so just becoming a more dominant position now is, I recognize that it's it's a human, or I recognize that it's killing a human, but that human's a parasite on me, and so what? I don't care. It's no longer, trying to justifying that it's a fetus or it's not human, but a statement of it's my right to choose that because it's my body and they're a parasite on my body.
Yep. Yeah, we've actually done a lot of that with our No Compromise podcast, where my wife and I talk back and forth. We started No Compromise when the Dobbs decision came down. And so that was the first thing we started to talk about, the topic of abortion. And one of the articles that we read on there was by a leftist, and we called this Where the Debate is Going. And one of the shocking things in the article, the woman said, and Jenny really picked up on this, and it just horrified her. She said, yes, the baby's like a beautiful flower, and we can pluck it. And we don't need to do anything else for it. It's a flower. And we should be willing to say, okay, we're killing a life. We're taking a life. And that's okay. And we talk about, I'm a philosophy professor, so I do teach logic. And we talk about slippery slope arguments. And slippery slopes are often called fallacies. But there are non-fallacious slippery slope arguments. And we've been on a vast slippery slope. You're old enough now to have seen it, right? We started with the notion that abortion should be rare, legal, but rare. And so nobody at that point would ever have said it was a good thing. And we're now to the point where we're talking about shouting our abortion. And we should be allowed to kill our babies. It doesn't matter. There's no talk of rare anymore. They don't want rare. They want abortion on demand. And we've done this on issue after issue after issue in the Western world. We have slid just a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. And now, suddenly, we're at the edge of a precipice and we're falling into it. And that's my point when I said, how did you go broke? Well, very slowly at first and then suddenly. And we've been on this slippery slope for a long time now, and we're just about to go over the cliff. And I don't know how to come back from it other than some sort of Christian revival, a turning back to God. And, I don't know if it's going to happen. If it happens, fantastic. And I want to be a part now. I want to stand against these evil tendencies in our society, which is why Jenny and I founded the Christian Atheist. We want to stand against it, strongly against it, as much as we can. But if it overtakes us and we're thrown down along with it, then I'm assuming more than likely we're in that time when Christ is about to return.
So, you'd said something earlier on the beginning of the podcast, and now I think it's appropriate to come back to that because I want to hear you elaborate on this. You had mentioned that we are committing suicide. I think you use the expression committing suicide more often, or
yep,
we're doing that now.
I did.
Can you explain what you mean by that? And I have a feeling that ties into what you were just saying.
It does, absolutely. So, Jesus came to earth 2,000 years ago, died, and changed the world. And largely the Western world, what we call the Western world today, went through this slow transition that allowed us to build up through the Renaissance and the scientific revolution into a world in which we've essentially produced, and I know I'm going to use this term loosely, but we've essentially produced a paradise on earth by following the basic dictates of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And in almost all at once, one philosopher, Hegel, managed to turn us away from that transcendent reality that anchors all of the Western world to an immanentist view, that is materialism, essentially, right? And that's, if I'm going to give one term to sort of explain what I mean by immanentist, it would be materialist. That is, this is all that there is right here. And we have come to believe that, even in the church today, I think, to such an extent that we no longer even believe in the fundamental concepts that anchor the Western world: truth, reality, and goodness. We are now in a period where, and I remember reading this verse when I was a kid, thinking, this is crazy, that could never happen. In Isaiah, I forget what chapter it is, but he says, "Woe to those who change evil for good and good for evil, who call darkness light and light darkness," and so forth. We are now in an era like that, when you can actually entertain as a rational position that you can choose your gender at a whim. You've abandoned any sense of objective truth. And I've spent a long time tracing the origin of that, but we are now at a point where we're living in our imagination. We are no longer connected to reality because we've abandoned the fundamentals that structured the Western world. And if we don't turn back from that and we keep going down this route, one of two things is going to happen. Either we're going to totally dissolve and Christ will return and it's the end of the age, or we're going into a tyranny and a new age in history. Because when the United States falls, I'm afraid we may be due for another dark age. I don't know. Because if China takes over, it's not going to be a pretty sight. So I don't know where exactly we're heading, but I do know we are on a very bad trajectory.
And why then would you not believe that an ideal like humanism could save us from that?
Humanism is an outgrowth of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And once you start to lose any transcendent sense of value, objective value, like you talked about with your guest last week, once you start to lose that objective sense of value, that transcendent value that is outside of us, to which we must simply conform ourselves, then value becomes merely a means to an end. And every end is a chosen end. And whoever gets to choose it, and that will be our oppressors, the people at the top, they will use whatever means they have at their disposal to achieve that end. And that means we are going to be ruled by a tyrant.
Yeah, but
and I mean, this is clearly laid out in Plato's Republic, Book 8.
Absolutely. So I've used that argument, and I've often gotten the response in some form of, but they did it wrong, we'll do it right. Something to that extent. That's a very simplistic version. But, whether it was socialism, they didn't institute it properly, we'll get it right. Humanism, to that extent. So why couldn't we? Why couldn't we get it right?
Because we are, and this is one of the fundamental problems with the entire structure, starting back with Hegel. We have a wrong view of humanity. We think that humanity is perfectible. We're not without God. And that's the fundamental problem. That's what we run up against. So if we lose the transcendent reality of a creator, and we forget that human beings are essentially sinful creatures, then we're going to start thinking that, we can make things right. This is fundamental Marx. I mean, this is straight out of Marx's thing. We're going to produce heaven on earth. And yet, every time humanity by itself sets out to create heaven on earth, they do what Satan did. They create hell on earth. And it's been proven over and over and over again through the 20th century and in history before that. So to trust in human beings to do it is to fail. And that's not a matter of, speculation. That's as close as you're ever going to get to his historical certainty.
Boy, we speak the same language, John. This is great. Yep. This is I'm so glad we connected and did this, because this is so good. It's more times than not, I think I have people on the show that it's, I'm learning from, I'm disagreeing from. This was great because I had to really, put myself in a position to say, okay, I gotta poke them. I gotta prod them, because I can't just sit here and agree with you on everything. I've got to counter. And I think I really appreciate your insight. Actually, I'm looking forward to listening more to the Christian Atheist, and yeah, I'm excited. This was good. Thank you for again connecting with me and coming on. I really appreciate this.
Me too. I'm glad you responded to the text Jenny sent out, and I'm glad that we were. Oh, the email. Sorry, not text. Email. Yeah. I'm old, way. Man. I can't keep this thing straight.
Either way, yeah. No, hey, I'm glad about it. Go ahead.
I just interviewed someone last week for the first time on the Christian Atheist. We never done interviews ever. Oh. But I interviewed someone last week who you might find also interesting. So I'm trying to spread the word for this guy. He's brilliant. The podcast is called What Do You Mean God Speaks? And the guy's name is Dr. Paul Seung Chung, Chung. What do you mean God speaks? And I don't agree with everything he has to say. Probably he and I, in terms of politics, might find some divergences. Mm-hmm. But what he has to say about God on that podcast is astounding. He's saying in different ways from me almost all the things I'm trying to say. And when I encountered this, I thought, wow, I got to talk to this guy. So we did, and it was fantastic. So I promised him I would spread the word.
Yeah, I'll go check it out. I'll listen to the podcast, and obviously I'm always looking for guests as well, especially, if I'm trying to do this on a weekly basis. We need lots of guests, because I don't want to just have the conversation by myself, or, I don't operate well that way. I need to have this dialogue. So, I'll look him up. Definitely. Yep. So for you and for Jenny, how can people get in touch with you? What do you want to leave behind as far as contact information and websites, all that type of stuff?
Okay, so you can always find us on YouTube, and that's probably the easiest way for most listeners to locate us. What's the name of our channel? YouTube channel? Just the Christian Atheist? Okay, so it's just the Christian Atheist with John Wise, right? And of course, we're trying to push the book because we don't really have any finances coming in to cover anything that we're doing. So we're trying to find some ways. This is the first year that God's actually started bringing a little bit to us, and we're starting to recoup some of it. But it's essentially been outlay for us, which is fine. I don't mind that at all. Well, Jenny's a professional photographer, and we're trying to bring in money that way. But the title of the book, once again, is Through the Looking Glass, and it tells the story of my return to Christ and the long journey back that it was. So if you go on Amazon, Through the Looking Glass with Dr. John Wise, and it'll come up. And then, of course, in the podcasting world, we're on all the major podcasting apps. So if you go to the Christian Atheist or to Simple Gifts with Dr. John Wise, you'll find me easily on both of those.
All right. Well, thanks again. again, I thought this was excellent. I really appreciate it. I enjoy so much talking to different people, and sometimes there's a real sense of camaraderie, brotherhood in the discussion, and it's it's the identity of Christ, I believe, between you and I.
God,
yeah,
sure.
And I appreciate it. It's nice to have that. So thank you again.
It is.
I appreciate it.
Yep.
So
it's nice to be on. There's two different type of podcast experiences. Jenny sends out to both of them. She tries to get me on atheist podcasts and on Christian podcasts. And it's always nice when I can sort of relax and know that I'm not going to be, have to be on my toes every second of the time.
yeah.
So if anybody's actually interested on YouTube, if you want to see me at my most combative in a nice way, watch my interview with Tom Jump on YouTube.
Well, great. He is Dr. John Wise. His wife is Jenny Wise. And you can find them as The Christian Atheist on YouTube and on podcasts, wherever they are. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the John Christie Podcast.
Like what you hear? Hate what you hear? Have some thoughts you'd like to get off your chest? We want to hear from you. Contact us at johnchristie.com and be a guest.